Welcome to Films and Stuff with your hosts, Pete Mitchell and Ethan Hunt.
Pete, Films and Stuff. This is the centennial episode.
Da-da-da-da!
Da-da-da-da! Number 100 of the Films and Stuff podcast. Congratulations, buddy.
Congratulations, we did it. We've done it, and I couldn't have done it without you and our listeners, of course.
Thank you, listeners. We appreciate it, and we've got hundreds more.
That's right. Remember, that's why we've got 4 digits in our episode naming scheme. We've got hundreds, maybe thousands more.
Maybe thousands. But I think for this special centennial episode, we have saved what is now a huge global topic, which is on Amazon Prime, The Rings of Power.
Yeah.
Where to begin?
Let's give a quick premise on the history of the show.
Before we do that, let's just put this in perspective for all the listeners, because I think you and I bring a unique perspective to this. I'm really embarrassed to say this out loud. I've never watched a Lord of the Rings movie, and I didn't actually know that there were 3 more movies about The Hobbit. So usually you and I are kind of like equal fans of Star Wars, Trek, all the other kind of sci-fi, mystical things. I am dramatically behind on Lord of the Rings. So for me, I don't have the same level of background. You, on the other hand, I would expect that you've probably read the books and that you know
multiple times, yeah,
all the lore. So you're probably the best person to kind of summarize.
I love the Lord of the Rings books so much, although I haven't read them in a long time now. But before every movie came out in the early 2000s, I read the book every time before I went to see the movies.
Wow.
I'm so pleased with Peter Jackson. I think he did such a good job with the movies. I was less pleased with The Hobbit. I think they did the typical Hollywood franchise thing, which was Lord of the Rings made $3 billion. Let's capitalize on that. Let's make a Hobbit movie, which really shouldn't have been more than a 2-hour-long Hobbit movie. Let's stretch that out into 7 hours over 3 movies. Let's add a bunch of nonsense content in there that wasn't in any of the books or in anything. Let's really fictionalize this more so it's not an adaptation at all. And to their credit, I mean, even though maybe I didn't like it so much, I don't know how much the critics liked it, the Hobbit movies also made $3 billion. So you can't, deny that they were onto something, at least in terms of commercial success. So anyway, to give that show context.
And one more thing, I guess we should say, one of our very good friends asked whether or not they should care about Rings of Power. No one, her exact words. And my response kind of was, look, Amazon paid $250 million for the rights. They've committed to 5 seasons and at least $1 billion in production cost. This is not going away. It's going to be prominent in pop culture for at least the next 5 years.
We think.
So we think. So you may not care about it now, but at least you should check it out to see whether or not it's something that you are going to care about, because you're going to be probably bombarded with it for the foreseeable future.
For good or for bad, this TV series is going to be a part of the cultural zeitgeist. So even if it's not your genre,
what a word,
like Game of Thrones, it would behoove you to at least be aware of it, because even if you're not talking about it, your neighbor will be, your family members will be, your friends will be. Somebody is going all in on this show. Again, whether good or bad. And if you want to be able to speak to them with some semblance of knowledge, you need to be watching this.
Are you all in?
I am tentatively all in. On paper, I'm all in. On execution, maybe not.
Tell me why. So what did you think about it? Before you start to summarize, what was your initial, what was your level of excitement going into this, and did it meet your expectations?
Okay, so that's complicated. It's really complicated because let's take a step back, right? So Amazon Studios, actually, let's be clear. Amazon Studios paid $250 million just for the rights to make this show.
$250 million just for the rights to this show.
So, and let's be really clear what those rights were for. The rights were for the characters that we know and love from the movies, and that's it. They didn't. That $250 million was a check that they wrote out to the Tolkien estate to say, "Hey, we want to borrow these titles, and we are committing to making 5 seasons of this show, but because we've paid for the rights, at the end of the day, the fact of the matter remains is, if we don't use those rights, that's up to us." So this is the first, not red flag, but the first question mark, right? Because why would you pay $250 million and then continue burning money thereafter? It becomes like a sunk cost fallacy, right? You don't want to do that. Then we just learned that Amazon Studios spent a staggering $465 million for 8 one-hour-long episodes. This is the most expensive TV show ever made in the history of television, period.
Do you think 8 episodes is a little bit short for this season?
I can't tell you that only because we don't know what the storyline is going to be for this season. And we don't know what the arc overall is going to be. I have a suspicion as to what the arcs are going to be, but there's no way to know that. When you're talking about this show, we don't know what the overall arc is. We just know that the show is set in the second age of the Lord of the Rings, let's say, not trilogy, let's call it the epic, right? The fantasy land, right?
Yeah.
And the movies were set in the third age, which was 1,000 years after when this TV show is set. Let's take a step back again. So let's talk about the money for a second, right? Because, and it's really important, and I don't want to hammer on I don't want people to think that I'm hammering on this because I think it's just a staggering number. It is a staggering number, but it's really important because if this show doesn't do well, there have been rumors and there have been stories released that people in charge of Amazon Studios have said, listen, if we spend $1 billion making this show and it's not a success, and that's for, by the way, just for season 1, they committed to $1 billion for 5 seasons. They've spent $1 billion so far, $715 million for the rights and the first 8 episodes, plus question mark amount for advertising and marketing, which has to be at least $200 or $300 million for a show this big. Amazon Studios wants to make this Amazon Prime Stranger Things or HBO Max's Game of Thrones. They want it to be on that level. And we've talked about this in the past. Amazon does not have a system seller or a platform seller. It doesn't have a show that says, I have to get Amazon Prime. The Boys is a great show, but it's a very niche show and it doesn't have the cachet beyond a certain genre. And it's not a systems or a platform seller. Game of Thrones is a platform seller for HBO. Yeah. Stranger Things has been a platform seller for Netflix. Amazon doesn't have anything, and I think that's why they've gone all in.
I felt like Wheel of Time was kind of their half-hearted effort to do that, right?
Wheel of Time cost $80 million to make for the first season. They spent $10 million an episode. This show is 9 times more expensive than that.
What's so expensive?
So let's talk about that, right?
CGI?
So when you look at this,
it looks dramatic, though.
Can
we at least admit it looks amazing?
I am with you. This is 100. You can see where every single penny of that $470 million has gone. This is by and far the most beautiful show And I would go so far as to say this looks better than most of the movies we've seen over the last year. Yeah. In terms of the vistas, the set design, the character, the costume design, the visual effects, the digital effects, all of it looks expansive and expensive. It looks unreal. It is definitely, when I say quite possibly the best TV show, let's not kid ourselves. It is the best looking TV show that we've ever seen on TV. Like, I challenge anyone to come to me and say, here's a show that looks better than not Game of Thrones, sorry, Rings of Power.
Can I say this though? How much is House of Dragon costing?
House of Dragon's budget, if I recall correctly, is $200 million.
For 8 episodes also?
Yes. I don't know if it's 8 or 10 episodes, but it's $200 million.
So when you look at, I mean, I agree. For me, House of Dragon looks very good. I agree that Rings of Power looks better, but does it look 4 times better?
Well, that's a question. And I think that's what we're going to dig down. We're going to do a deep dive on.
Yeah.
So I think that, look, it's an expensive show. It looks at, in terms of the premise, let's take a look at the quick premise. So far, the story focuses on Galadriel, Sauron. We've met Elrond. We've met the race of creatures that will eventually become the hobbits. I'm sure by the end of this season, we will have met a few more familiar faces that we've seen in the movies.
I agree.
Yeah. And we don't exactly, like we said, we don't exactly know where what the story is about. Mm-hmm. But by the end of the second episode, so far they've only released 2 episodes. We're pretty sure that it's obviously going to be about how Celebrimbor forges the Rings of Power, the different rings.
Right.
And I'm almost certain by the end of episode 8, we're going to learn that Sauron has come in and created the One Ring that controls them all. I suspect that's going to happen in season 1, because if it doesn't, it's kind of like a bit of a tease.
Yeah.
Yeah. Again, the disadvantage this show has is we know how it ends, right? We've seen the trilogy. This is a canon show. So we know where all the different characters end up based on the Fellowship of the Ring, which we saw back in 2001. Right? This is a prequel. That's the premise so far. That's all I can tell you. It's set on Middle Earth. It's about, the war between Melkor, who, this is going to sound heavy nerd territory. You really should have read the books to really get a better understanding. But for those of you who haven't, my Cliff's Notes version is there's a bad guy called Melkor. And again, forgive me if I'm butchering the names or if I'm forgetting the names. I haven't read these books in almost 20 years now, so I can't remember them all. So
don't be so modest.
The bad guy's name is Melkor. He, in the lore, gets defeated. Sauron, who was the same race as Galadriel and all of these guys, who was an elf, well, kind of like an elf, defects, becomes a bad guy. He helps create the Rings of Power with Celebrimbor, who is an elven master, like blacksmith, or not blacksmith, but smith. He makes these rings and secretly forges the One Ring, and that One Ring allows him to control all of the other rings, and because the rings were given to the other races, it allows him to control the other races. That's why you have the Nazgul, etc., and then you see that there's ultimately a war to defeat Sauron the first time. They defeat him the first time, but because this is a classic fantasy novel, he doesn't really ever die. His spirit lives on. And then it comes back to life, which is what we see in the movies in the Third Age. And then you have another battle to really end him forever. That's the really quick and dirty. There's a lot more nuance. So again, I'm sure we're going to get comments.
There's something really important for this. And I think this is probably figured within the Amazon Studios, calculation as well, which is you don't have to know the Lord of the Rings in order to follow this.
Yes.
And that's good for me. And that's good for a majority of the people out there, right?
100%.
Because even
that's the beauty of this prequel.
Yeah. So like you said, you know where it ends. You read the books. You saw the trilogy. You know where this ends up. For me, I kind of know the idea of the Lord of the Ring. There's like one ring and they want to throw it back into the volcano where it came from and destroy it. And there's a lot of trials and tribulations and personal growth and challenges and blah, 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 blah along the way. That's the end. The beginning is now. And I don't need to know anything about the landscape or the lay of the land, if you will. I can just tune in and pick everything up. So yes, if you've read the books, if you've seen the movies, then you probably know a little bit more about the setup. But all these events are basically created directly by Amazon. They're not in the books, so to speak, right?
So to speak, or if they are, they're... So, the way Tolkien wrote some of the books is, other than the Lord of the Rings book, and maybe the Hobbit book, the rest of the published materials were really more like a collection of notes that he published. And there were a lot of things that were, or certainly the Silmarillion was, right? It's like the Silmarillion is treated as like an appendix. It's not really treated as like a novel. So there's a lot of inferences made. There's a lot of story given, but there's not really, it's not the most clear, narratively driven, structured book. So you're absolutely right. The beauty of this program is that there's no baggage required. There's no previous knowledge required. It's like watching the MCU start all the way over again with Iron Man 1. You don't need to do homework to sit down and enjoy this TV show.
Yeah.
Because of that, the comments and criticisms that I have of this show don't really have much to do with the narrative structure or the narrative of the story. Yeah. And I think that's a really important caveat. I want to make it clear. I love the story of the Lord of the Rings saga, as it were. But in terms of this show in particular, I think it would be unfair and probably unwise of us to sit down and critique the story because it's a little bit nebulous, 1. 2, it's something we haven't seen before. And 3, most importantly, we've only seen 2 out of the 8 episodes. I think it's unfair for us to say, oh, well, this is going to be terrible because the narrative is wrong. Well, we don't know what the narrative is yet. We have an idea of where it's going, and that's it.
Is this show going to be successful because of the narrative or because of the visuals or because of it's just on Amazon and it's going to be like pushed like hell?
It's going to be a good combination of all 3 of those. I think it's going to be a very healthy combination. And by the way, that's presupposing that it is going to be successful. And that, I think, is where we're going to talk about what we should be talking about today. When we critique it, I'm not going to critique it again based on that, but I'm going to... So the number one critique, let's just dive into it, right? Let's not hide behind this anymore. What did you think about the episode lengths? When you watched them, what did you think?
I thought this was very good. I have to say, I thought the first 2 episodes were very good. I'm not emotionally attached to anyone yet. I mean, I think we've only got one character, right? Which is
Galadriel.
Yeah, Galadriel, which is really the only character I think that we've got any kind of strong emotional attachment to. And that's a familiar name, of course. I mean, I guess we heard her or saw her in the other...
Played by Cate Blanchett.
Yeah. So, I mean, I thought that it looks great. It looks expensive. I'm not like... I thought the length was okay, but I didn't think there was anything about the story that I'm like immediately like, wow, this is like blown my mind. I've got to see where this goes. This is super, super cool, right? I mean, it's... I don't know. I guess I think it was smart that they did 2 episodes right away rather than just a single episode. I think after a single episode, I would have been more indifferent. Yeah. I think 2 was right to kind of get me a little bit more involved. But I have to say, I don't think that this is a I'm not emotionally invested in it yet. Let's put it that way.
Yeah. Yeah.
But
I think that's
helps.
a fair
It helps.
assessment.
I had to do a lot of. I mean, I know that I've said that you don't need to know anything about this story before you start, and that's absolutely true. You can watch it as though it's an Amazon original, and you can pick it up. There's nothing stopping you from picking it up. However, I think it is a rich story, and you do need to do a little bit of research on the who, the what, the where, the why, the blah, 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 to just give yourself a little bit of context in terms of what these things are. That probably helps you appreciate it more. And I think the more you invest in the show, the more you understand. And I think that's a little bit of a challenge maybe for Amazon, that for someone like you who's read the books, you've seen Lord of the Rings, you'll pick it up and you'll probably be into it. They're going to have to really help someone like me, like my sisters, people that have not been so into Lord of the Rings to like really become into it, because something like, we got to compare, the obvious comparison is going to be House of Dragon.
Yeah.
Everyone kind of knows House of Dragon a little bit, right?
Yeah. So I think that for me, and tell me what you think of this statement. This could be a hot take. I couldn't help but feel that the producers of this show said that, okay, they finished the first cut of the episode. It was 40 minutes long. And then somebody at the studio executive said, we just spent $470 million making the first 8 episodes. You need to make this another 20 minutes long to justify the price. That I couldn't help but feel
honest,
that some of the episodes felt like they were dragging. And by some, I mean the first 2 episodes.
I didn't notice it. I have to say,
okay.
I'm usually pretty in tune with these things until you raised it. I have to say, episode length for me didn't feel like an issue. I guess it kind of felt like they were both a little bit longer than a traditional episode, but I attributed that to the fact that they're the first episodes released, which generally are a little bit longer.
Yeah.
And I have to say, it shouldn't be 40 minutes. I mean, if you're really trying to not just get your money's worth, but give the audience an immersive experience, why are you only giving them 40 minutes? I mean, that's close to sitcom length, right? I mean, we're getting close to Ted Lasso territory if you're going to have a 40-minute episode, right? I mean, especially if you're only having 8. Man, 8 to me is a very short season.
Yeah, I know what you're saying, but I couldn't help but feel like there were times where if I were wearing a watch, I'd be looking down at my wrist and being like, what is going on? Why is this here? Why is this scene here? It felt a little padded to me.
Can you give me an example of a scene? Give me an example of a scene that you thought was a little bit...
like when we get introduced to the hobbits, or the proto-hobbits. There was a sequence or two there where we learned that Nori is going... She's clearly the rebel of the group, and she goes and takes a bunch of the kids out for the berries.
Yeah.
I don't know how necessary that scene was.
I mean, I have to say, I think that's a very good point. And that's also kind of bang for your buck. For me, I agree with you. Like the pre-Hobbits is the most boring part of the show. And if you're asking me, Nuri is like the least compelling character. This kind of precocious teen who's always kind of getting in trouble and thinks that there's more adventure out there and making bad decisions because of like, for me, this is like not at all what I would be looking at for this show, right? I'm looking at
She's clearly going to be important.
Yes.
I think we all know that.
Yeah.
But I felt like they were kind of hitting us over the head with the character.
Yeah. You're right.
Again, and this is purely speculative on my part, but I just can't help but feel like, okay, we could have shaved a couple of minutes off here and there in that way. And, this could just be a Pete problem. This may not be an episode problem or like a series problem. This could just be a Pete problem. It could also be that, maybe I was being a little impatient. Fine. I don't know. I just thought that it was a little long in tooth in certain parts. That was my feeling.
But I mean, the history of entertainment has been filled with annoying characters that
Yeah.
that submarine an entire franchise. Think back to Star Wars Episode 1, Jar Jar Binks.
Yeah.
These inconsequential characters that are inserted prominently and mess things up is really a problem. And I think on your first few episodes, you should be avoiding annoying characters that are going to turn people off. And you should be focused on introducing kind of the protagonists, right? Your most compelling characters and presenting them in the most positive light and getting people extraordinarily emotionally invested in them, right? Galadriel is a good example. I think they could have made her a little bit more compelling at the beginning. Like the entire thing about, she's basically a psychopath, who's got problems letting go of her brother's death, right? For all intents and purposes. I think they could have positioned that a little bit more so we'd have more, empathy for her or a little bit more understanding of her plight and her singular devotion, right? It would have been better, I think, to, introduce another protagonist as well and hold off on Nuri until people have kind of already emotionally invested in the series and then bring in someone like that.
Okay. So look, let me move on to my next point. And I think this is probably something this is going to persist over not just the next 6 episodes.
Hot take coming up. Bring it, Pete.
My feeling is that in this show particularly, no matter what Amazon Studios has done or will do, was going to generate a lot of controversy. Because
I think that's right.
I think, and that's not the hot take. I think it's because a lot of people consider Peter Jackson's Lord of the Rings films to be sacrosanct. The problem with that is this show has become, because of that, the show has become really hard to watch objectively for 2 reasons, right? For me. 1, I loved the original trilogy, Peter Jackson's. And 2, there is a lot of noise surrounding the show. A lot. More so than any other show we've seen on any other platform or any other system seller or platform seller. Okay? You've got the one faction which is like the anti-Jeff Bezos brigade. No matter what he does, because he's a billionaire and because he owns Amazon, nothing he can do will ever be either right or good enough. Then you've got a whole other faction who, and again, I don't approve at all in one way, shape, or form, but these are the guys who I would call like the racist/bigots. This show casts a lot of people of color, and what these guys have done, which is what we've seen in Bridgerton, which is to say, hey, we're going to have people of color playing different races. They weren't in the original movies, but they will be in this, and we're not going to address it at all. So if you see a black elf or a black dwarf or a South Indian or South Asian, hobbit or whatever, we're not going to address that at all. They just are, like it or lump it. And of course, you know that there's going to be a strong contingent of these racist guys online, these bigots, who are like, well, the original trilogy didn't have any people of color, so how do you justify having people of color here? It's just a lot of nonsense noise. That takes up a lot of energy and makes a lot of noise. And then the third thing is that the amount of money spent of producing this thing, and eventually there will be some controversial narrative choices, that creates a lot of noise. And then you also have another thing, which is like there's controversial stories and rumors about the process of making this that's created a lot of noise, right? So it was rumored that Peter Jackson actually came to Amazon and said, listen, I created the movies. I helped the Tolkien estate make something that they were proud of. I am more than happy to be a script supervisor. I don't necessarily need to be a creative part of the programming or of the directing, but I'm happy to look over your script. And apparently Amazon said no, get lost to Peter Jackson. which kind of burns a lot of their goodwill, right? When this guy is going out of his way to say, hey, look, I created what most people consider the perfect trilogy of this book. Why wouldn't you want me involved?
You think that's true or not true?
Apparently it's true. Because if you look, apparently it's also like a part of the trivia section on IMDb, which is owned by Amazon. There are rumors that early reviews for the series were paid for by Amazon. Everyone was saying that the show is a masterpiece. Like, all the early reviews have been saying that the show is a masterpiece. And all the fans have been like, this is terrible. It's, again, similar to what we saw when we were talking about God's Favorite Idiot, where the critical review on Tomato Meter was very low, but the user review was very high. And then now Amazon is under, they're saying that Amazon has, which again owns IMDb. Apparently Amazon has been deleting user reviews on the webpage. I don't know if that's true or not, but that's a rumor. And then Amazon now has put a block on users leaving reviews on the website. So there's a lot of this noise and controversy, and it's just like there's an unending barrage of negative stories that have nothing to do with the actual show.
I'm surprised there's so much negativity about this. I would expect this show to be met with only enthusiasm, actually, until it's actually come out and people have judged it. And I haven't seen anything that's so negative about this show, actually.
Why? All the negativity, I think, is coming from what I would consider a very vocal minority. These are the Twitter users, the Twitter army, and you know how we talked about these bots and all that kind of thing? I think we're seeing a lot of that.
What do you think? Here's not a hot take, but kind of like a conspiracy theory, which is, I have to say, I'm really skeptical that there is a large vocal majority. I would expect that Netflix, HBO are also probably supporting their own kind of proxy bot army to kind of poo-poo this as well. Right? I mean, especially HBO, which has a huge invested interest in now House of Dragon going head to head with this. I mean, I don't know how many individuals are out there that are really making a lot of noise, or if HBO is like, hey, you know what? Let's hire a firm, and the firm can put 1,000 like negative reviews on. I kind of feel like this is just corporate to corporate, like proxy warfare. It's really hard for me to understand that there's a whole lot of negativity about this yet.
So let me say a couple things. One, this is allegedly the case or not the case. Films and Stuff does not believe that this is a factual thing. These are merely opinions that bot armies are fighting.
I don't know why you always try to walk back my conspiracy theories. I love my compliance department.
Second,
it's true. We don't have anything to base this on. It's
but
purely speculation, of course.
But I'm with you. I like a good conspiracy theory, but you know, another counter to that is HBO has been so petty. You must have seen this. On Friday, HBO released the entire first episode, the pilot of House of Dragons, for free on YouTube. And they said, oh, is this coincidentally the day when Rings of Power has come out? Oops, our bad. Why don't you watch a show that's free, you don't need a subscription for, and entirely based on an IP that everybody knows and loves that's much more recent? I mean, the ultimate petty move. But also,
is that petty? I don't know if that's petty.
No, I think it's a very effective way of marketing, right?
Yeah, I think that's more effective. I mean, petty would be if they would like kind of somehow trash it, but if they would like take, I don't know, even know if you can watch like Lord of the Rings on HBO, but if they'd take it down, for example, or make it not available, that would be like petty. But I mean, I think that kind of makes sense. I mean, HBO's got a lot invested in House of Dragon, but I don't want to go back to my conspiracy theory, and I agree with you. It's just an idea. But remember how maybe like 2 years ago, there was this alleged push by DC fans that wanted the the Snyder cut, right?
Oh my God, yeah.
And haven't we found out subsequently that allegedly huge vocal group actually wasn't so big? It was kind of like spurred on by Snyder himself.
I don't know if Snyder was directly involved in that. I don't remember if he was.
Yeah, the allegations now are...
He didn't have anything, and then they kind of said, okay, fine, there's a lot of people doing it. Here's $50 million, go make your cut.
Just like Ryan Reynolds released like that audition of the trailer for Deadpool, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Good, good call. Right? What a great recall.
I thought it was found out that the vocal fans that were demanding the Snyder cut, that there may have been some, but it was a lot of it like a frenzy kind of whipped up by Snyder himself, saying, oh, by the way, I've got this amazing cut. You guys should try to like convince the studio to like let me release it. You know,
I mean, I don't know if that's true, but I love that story. Yeah, I love that idea.
It's come out now. The new narrative is that apparently he kind of like stoked this frenzy, and then he just kind of threw his hands up at the time and said, "Oh, you know, the fans want it. What can I do?" You know, but no one even kind of knew about this until he disclosed it and kind of like whipped up his own frenzy, very similar to what Ryan Reynolds did for Deadpool. That's why I kind of feel like, I mean, again, I'm not pointing fingers, but I feel like when we say that there's this very vocal group that's either happy or not happy, I kind of feel like some of this is whipped up by someone who's got a it's manufactured in a way.
Yeah. Maybe.
I mean, there's so much noise on Twitter and stuff. It's hard to take like any of this too seriously, right?
Yeah, and ultimately so you hit the nail on the head, and that's the problem, is when you have a show like this and when there's so much noise, it's really hard to gauge, because ultimately you are going to get influenced one way or another. It's almost impossible for us to not be influenced by external factors. Yeah. So it becomes very difficult to be as objective about the show as humanly possible, right? So I don't know. I sat down and I thought about this for a couple hours yesterday, and I came up with a few what I thought are solutions to Amazon's problems.
Is there a problem? Is there a problem?
Not problem per se, but the noise surrounding this.
Yeah.
Right? As in, how do you minimize the noise? Because on one hand, noise is good because it creates more publicity, and more awareness and publicity can only help your show.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, too much negative influence and publicity also has the effect of saying, hey, I'm not going to watch this if there's so much controversy, right? Because for the rest of us who aren't so tuned into social media, I mean, I'm not going to go out of my way to watch a show that if I hear it's being trashed, I'm not going to hate watch it. I'm just going to say, fine, I have more things to do in my life. If it's bad and if everyone's saying it's bad, why will I sit down and spend 2 hours of my life wasting it on that?
So tell me what your solutions are.
So these are some of my proposed solutions, some of them which they probably can't implement because it's too late. But I would have said the first thing they should have done is they should have scaled the show back and scaled it down. And instead of pursuing the license for characters that we already know and love and have already seen on screen, I think what they could have done was to pursue licensing for the world, but have the story be something standalone or unrelated set in this universe. So that if you want to talk about Galadriel, people can be like, oh yeah, I know of this elf Galadriel, but the story isn't about Galadriel. It's just a totally unrelated story. There's so many elves, there's so many orcs, there's so many goblins, there's so many hobbits. There's a world of opportunities for a completely brand new narrative that's set in the world, but not about the people that we know.
Okay.
Right? Oh, and it doesn't even need to be on Middle Earth. It could have been about Valar, something we haven't talked about at all. And a lot of that noise would have immediately disappeared, because then you can't tell me, oh, well, I can't believe they're doing this to Galadriel or they're doing this to Elrond. All of that goes away because they're just like, yeah, they are in this show, or they're in this universe. You're not going to see them. We're not going to talk about them. We may hear a rumor about them, but that's it. We're not interested. Because the show is about Galadriel, because the show is about Elrond, the natural instinct is for you and me to make comparisons to Cate Blanchett and Hugo Weaving and so forth. It's not fair to the stars of this show. They are good actors on their own right. And that comes to the second thing I would have done, which is I would have hired at least one, if not more, serious A-list stars.
Oh.
And this is, I mean, with the greatest of respect to Lenny Henry, if you look at that cast of on IMDb, the only name I know and really remember is Lenny Henry, who is one of the funniest and maybe the most charismatic comedians that the UK has ever produced. But he does not have the star power to carry the show on his back, and certainly not as a very, very minor character in a very minor role. So, and if you look at Galadriel and Elrond, Clark and Aramayo, they're doing a very good job as those characters. But let's, look at the lineup. How can you compare Clark to Kate Blanchett? Or Aramayo to Hugo Weaving? Or Ian McKellen? Or Christopher Lee? John Rhys-Davies? Liv Tyler? Viggo Mortensen? Andy Serkis? Sean Bean? And I've excluded all of the hobbits in this. Just look at the non-hobbits in this. That is a stellar lineup. And this isn't a stellar
We should have
lineup
made this a debate. We should have made this a debate episode.
Oh, maybe.
This is good.
And not just us. And that's not, these guys weren't stars because of the Lord of the Rings. These guys were all good established actors before Lord of the Rings. They added something extra to the Lord of the Rings, and the show doesn't have it. And, okay, forget about the Lord of the Rings. Go to The Hobbit. Cumberbatch, Martin Freeman, Ian McKellen again, Evangeline Lilly. On paper, that cast is miles ahead of the cast of the TV show, and I have to say this, no disrespect to the cast of the TV show. None whatsoever. They're all doing a stand-up job in their characters. But if you are someone who's never watched any of the movies or read any of the books, other than the fact that Amazon spent $1 billion on this show, I think it would be nice for you, for example, or our friends who has never watched the show, to know that there's at least one actor in there that they know and recognize, right? How do you pull them in otherwise?
Do you mind if I make a response to that?
No, please.
I hear your point. That makes a lot of sense. But I have to say, I'm actually okay with this. I think I'm okay with it for two reasons. And the first is that, Amazon paid so much for the IP. Mm-hmm. Right? That it's already part of the Lord of the Rings trilogy. It's already connected to that somehow, right?
Yep.
Even though it's called Rings of Power, that it's part of Lord of the Rings. It's already got that connection to it. It's got the recognition. You don't really need to add another person to it. I don't think it actually adds anything. I don't think there's anyone who makes a subscribe or not subscribe decision because someone else is taking this role. And I think you really need huge A-list, like Orlando Bloom, Kate Blanchett level in order to move the needle a little bit, And
Mm-hmm.
And I think the second part of that is that if they're really going to make 5 seasons, I can understand why they want a cast that doesn't have any commitments. They don't know anything about travel schedules. They don't know about locations. They don't know, they probably can't get the cast that they want. So I probably imagine that we just want everyone to be doing nothing but dedicated to this. We want you all the time for reshoots or touch-ups or voiceover work or whatever it is. We're not dealing with Orlando Bloom and he's only got, 48 hours between this and this. We've got to squeeze it in. I imagine that they said, look, this is our own intellectual property. We bought this. We put $1 billion into it. We want everyone to be available when and where we need them. We're not running all over the place, for some A-lister who's not going to actually, add to the subscriptions anyway. I can see both perspectives on that, but I'm leaning towards, for me, that's not a problem with this show. I don't think it's missing star power. If this show doesn't make anyone into a star, that's the problem with the show. But I don't think that the lack of the star power is why someone is going to subscribe or not subscribe.
This is like a debate episode because that was an excellent rebuttal, I must admit. I didn't even think of all that. Yeah, you're right. When you spend $1 billion, you want to be able to tell the actor you're mine for the next 5 seasons and for the next 5 years. Yeah. So that's fair enough. I would also say that opening scene where we see, well, not opening, the first fight scene we see in that first episode where the group of elven warriors take on the ice troll.
Yes.
I thought that was terrible.
Oh, really?
Oh, I thought that was really weak. Yeah, I thought that I'm going to compare, and again, this is not an apples to apple comparison. I am aware of that, but because you're basing this on the same IP and because you're using literally the same title, except for just a different subtitle.
Yeah.
Compare the first film's opening scene, which had an epic score, a chilling monologue by / exposition dump by Cate Blanchett, a thrilling epic fight sequence, and that basically sums up the current state of the world. And in this show, you had an elite warrior group of elves, and the elves are known to being like the best of the best of the best fighters. They're supposed to be like an unbelievable fighting force. They almost get taken out by one troll before Galadriel single-handedly jumps off of somebody else's sword and kicks its ass almost single-handedly. The trope of a single warrior handling a problem that the entire troop of elites cannot do, it's a little tiresome and a little worn down. I think it would have been way better if you saw, instead of just one ice troll, maybe 3 or 4 of them, and you see all 8 to 10 elves kicking total ass as a unit. We saw how Legolas did this in the movies, in the trilogy. He was able to take on guys on his own, and he did a wonderful job. Why couldn't they do something like that with this? It robbed us not only of a cool opening fight, but it also robbed us of a chance to demonstrate how good the elven warriors are. In fact, what you learn in that group is that the only one who has any kind of courage or ability is Galadriel, and the rest of them kind of just keep quiet, shirk their duties, and then go back and then quietly accept their rewards, right? And it didn't sit right with me.
I have to say, so as I think back, the way that this opened was they had like a very young Galadriel.
Yeah, a flashback.
Like with her like paper boat, right? And then we had like a little bit of exposition where they showed like this, I guess, war scene where like everything is kind of burning and you see like the stack of the elf helmets and stuff like that, right? With all the dead soldiers, you see Galadriel like put, the one helmet to the pile, and then she's with her brother, and then she says, "Hey, I'm going to fight," right? And then I agree, they're kind of like, they're climbing up this ice ledge, and then they're walking through the snow, and everyone wants to quit, and she's the only one with fortitude. And then they get inside, and they kind of discover a map, and you're right, then there's one ice troll. I mean, personally, I didn't really have a problem with it. It didn't turn me off, except it clearly, like, demonstrated to me that Galadriel is the only person who's fighting, and she's just like head and shoulders better than everyone else. I mean, the way that she killed the ice troll was almost with like indifference or boredom. It was like, oh, like I'll take care of this, like slash stab. Okay, he's dead. Not dead yet. I'll stab him one more time in the head. That's it. So I mean, I found that like it was intended to show that she's just like this incredible soldier. I didn't understand what you just expressed to me, which is that this elf army is supposed to be like Navy SEALs. I didn't know that. It didn't come across to me at all, maybe because I don't know the lore, but I mean, it did occur to me that like everyone else is like not very strong fighters compared to her.
I found it a little disheartening / disappointing, but fine, that could just be me. And that's okay. Maybe they just really wanted to elevate Galadriel. Fine. Okay. Also, okay. It just didn't sit 100% right with me.
Yeah.
And I think the other thing, we've spoken a little bit about the budget, but we'll get back to that. But I think the other thing they could have done is the timing of the release. I can't help but feel like they should have released the show either 2 or 3 months later, deep into the fall lineup, or earlier in the season when they didn't have much television competition in their landscape. Right now, they are 100% on schedule to be competing with House of the Dragon every week.
I would
That
tell you
is a tall order.
So let me add a little bit of American football context to this.
Yeah.
Which is last night was essentially week 1 of the college football season.
Right.
And next week is week 1 of the NFL season. So I have to say, I guess from their perspective, if they didn't do it last week, it would have really got caught up in, kind of like the American football season when everyone's got a lot of stuff to do in terms of fantasy football, watching university football, the tailgates start, the NFL starts, like everything. I also have to say, I agree with you a little bit. It's very strange window to choose because it is going head to head with House of Dragon. And if they would have waited a little bit, maybe it would have been better in the autumn. But then probably their concern was that it gets caught up and everyone's going back to school. Everyone's back from holiday. I think they had a really tough stretch. And I'm not sure if it should have waited like another 2 months until it's like deep autumn and everyone's like inside when it's cold, or if it should have happened kind of in the spring when there was not a lot going on.
I didn't think of this in the sporting context.
Yeah.
I just thought purely as, okay, we have 2 prize fighters entering the ring at the same time, effectively.
Who wins that fight?
So that's the question I was just about to ask you. Literally was about to ask you. So we've got House of the Dragon based on a prequel based on not season 8 of Game of Thrones, right?
Yeah.
The last season dropped in 2019. So it's still relatively fresh in everyone's mind. At least the world is.
Yeah.
Versus Rings of Power, which is very much a prequel to the Hobbit trilogy, which last released in 2011. And maybe not the most critically successful compared to The Lord of the Rings. But fine, we still compare it to The Hobbit. That was 10 years ago.
And The Lord of the Rings was 20 years ago.
And The Lord of the Rings was 20 years ago. So, good question. Who do you think wins? Are you more excited for Rings of Power or are you more excited for House of the Dragon?
I'm probably more excited for House of the Dragon. I think that, I don't think it's an either or, but I would expect that if people have subscribed to HBO Max for House of Dragon, I don't think that they're probably going to also subscribe to Amazon Prime to watch Rings of Power. I would imagine if you've already got Amazon Prime, then you're fine. But if you had to make a decision, probably a few weeks ago, you've already subscribed to HBO, and you're probably not going to make that second subscription to Amazon Prime. I would expect, though, that one of the things that Amazon really needed, I have nothing to back this up, right? I've got Amazon Prime, right? Amazon Prime is really easy to get. Almost everybody uses Amazon somehow just to order stuff, right? And it's not very expensive as well. But I have to say, Amazon Prime is pretty thin in terms of stuff to watch. Like, you and I are huge television junkies. Okay, Carnival Row, Night Sky, Outer Range. We've got a lot of stuff on Amazon Prime that we've kind of liked, but for the rank and file, let's say, I don't mean that derogatorily. I mean, like, my mom, sisters, brother, like normal kind of people that have like full-time jobs and aren't like interested in watching like power watchers of television. I would imagine that anyone who had Prime Video was kind of thinking of dropping it. There wasn't really anything compelling. And I would guess, this is just a guess. I have no data to back up this guess. Anecdotal only. Amazon may have seen, wow, either people are dropping their subscription because it's really easy to drop, or the amount of minutes watched is really, really low. We don't have anything that's getting people's attention. We need to spend a huge amount of money and put something super dramatic on there, if not to get more subscriptions, to just stop the carnage and get people a little bit excited about there's something for me to do and there's a reason for me to continue to pay whatever the small amount is every month. It may just be kind of like stopping the bleeding rather than trying to get more people to subscribe fresh.
I am with you 100%. Amazon Prime, for me, is probably always the last streaming platform I look at to find a show I want to watch. Always the last, because it doesn't come to mind as the first thing to watch.
Yeah. And that's crazy because even when you're on Amazon.com, there's loads of like ads, right? Banners for Amazon, for Prime Video. And I have to say, they're just like nothing to me. Yeah. I can't even remember what they're touting because everything is so underwhelming on Prime Video. Now at least they've got something and they can put Rings of Power and plaster it everywhere. And at a minimum, I think it stops people from discontinuing their membership. So I feel like they did it now rather than waiting 2 months, because they're like, if we wait 2 months, we may not have any users left on the platform. We are in real need to put something on now.
I don't know. The way I look at it is I am a Lord of the Rings fan. I'm not a super fan, but I'm a fan. I know a little bit of the lore. I've read the books. I loved the movies. I watched The Hobbit. I did all of that. And if you said, all right, you've got an hour a week to watch one of two shows, House of the Dragon or Rings of Power.
House of Dragon.
I would watch House of the Dragons over Ring of Power. And that says something about, it says something about the cultural cachet that Game of Thrones has, but it also says something about all the noise around Lord of the Rings. On paper, I should be all in on Rings of Power.
These are a little bit similar shows, right? I mean, there's no guns, there's no shooting.
High fantasy, epics.
Yeah. Yep. But I would say, for me, Game of Thrones is about, it's really a drama, right? And it's a little bit raunchy. There's drinking, there's nudity/sex, there's scandal, right? Whereas Game of Thrones Rings of Power is more about the journey and the messaging and the visuals, right? They are not dissimilar genres, but they cater, I think, to different things. And you really have to like the visuals and the fantasy element of Rings of Power to appreciate it, I think.
Very crude comparison I would make is to say that one is targeted for adults and the other is targeted for young adults. It's almost like...
Yeah.
It's not for children, don't get me wrong. Rings of Power isn't for children, but at the same time, it's the central conflict is, and I don't mean this badly, it's child. When I say childish, I don't mean childish, it's simplistic. Right? And that's not a bad thing, by the way. A simple conflict is always better than a complicated one, sure. But the nuance in watching House of the Dragons or Game of Thrones requires a lot more nuance because there's a lot more political machinations going on.
Yeah.
And whereas in Lord of the Rings, it's a lot more cut and dried. It's a lot more black and white, which is, hey, we've got a bad guy. We know how to end him. This is what we have to do. And in Game of Thrones, there were times where you were rooting for the Lannisters. There were times you were rooting for the Starks. It was so complicated that not even all the bad guys, even they were the quote-unquote bad guys, you were still kind of rooting for them.
Yeah.
in no circumstance could you see me rooting for Sauron or Melkor or an orc in Lord of the Rings. Under no circumstance.
Yeah.
But in Game of Thrones,
you're right.
There were moments where I was like, oh man, I really feel for Jaime Lannister or for Tyrion or for elements of the Lannisters or for, even in this case, the elements of the Targaryens.
That's a very good point. I mean, I also have to say, you raised a good point. For Rings of Power, we know how it ends. I have no idea how House of Dragon ends. I mean, even though we kind of do.
Very broadly at best.
Yeah.
But you're right. Even in Game of Thrones, we don't really know what happened to the Targaryens. We just know that they were kind of disappeared.
We know that they are no longer ruling the Iron Throne. They're no longer in King's Landing. But yes, we don't actually know how they were replaced, when they were replaced.
Yeah.
Even now, we're not really sure whether it's going to be Daemon or the girl, right?
Yep.
Who kind of takes over. That could still play out either way. I agree with you. Lord of the Rings, we all kind of knew where it would end up. It was more the journey, the fellowship, the camaraderie, the overcoming that was, the journey that you were supposed to appreciate and be a part of. I mean, ultimately, should we make a prediction now and see if we're right or wrong in 100 episodes? Do you think this is going to make it for 5 seasons?
I think so. I think by the end of this season, a lot of that noise is either going to be completely disregarded or it's going to just quiet down on its own, because ultimately I have faith in the fact that
I think it was good. I think the first 2 episodes were good.
They were not bad. I expected them to be, based on the noise you heard, I expected them to be horrendous. Yeah. I'm not expecting this to be... I wouldn't... If you ask me right now what my review for the entire season is, I would say that right now, based on episodes 1 and 2, it's a mooch, not a must-subscribe, but it's certainly not a skip. And the noise made me think, oh my god, this is going to be a skip. It's going to be terrible from the get-go. And of course it's not. It's beautiful. It's really well done. Cinematography is fantastic. Writing isn't bad. Yeah. We don't know where the narrative structure is going to go, but at the end of the day, it's not going to be terrible because, they've spent $1 billion on this thing.
Look, if you're just looking at the asset of Amazon, my perspective is that Amazon prior to this had really nothing worthwhile on their platform.
Yes.
I know they had some Chris Pratt movie. They've got Lock and Key? They've got Carnival Row with Orlando
Carnival
Bloom.
Row, etc.
But to be honest, they just had, it was like a potluck, a bunch of kind of broken toys, right? And it wasn't great, I think that they really needed this, and they probably overpaid, but they probably overpaid to prevent it from going to a competitor. And they probably overpaid because they knew that they needed something that made a splash, and they needed some headlines. And if the cost of the headlines was an extra $50 million of what they should have paid, fine. And if the cost of the headline to use Galadriel was another $25 million, fine. But I think that they kind of looked at that as, let's not look at what the asset is worth. It's in order to get some excitement and enthusiasm for our platform. And I think this is, the cost of doing business to get something like this.
Yeah. And I think actually you raised an even better point, which was actually, if I had all that money in the world, you're right, I wouldn't mind spending an extra $100 million to ensure that Apple TV didn't get it or that Netflix didn't get it. I think that's really important.
Yeah. Although I have to say, sometimes you're bidding against yourself, because I'm really not sure that Apple or Netflix would have done the same thing. But in any case, that's neither here nor there. One question I had for you, and I posed it to you, is what does this mean for the rest of the stuff on Amazon? Does this mean we're going to get a bunch of cheap documentaries? And they're not going to have any other Amazon originals. Specifically, what's going to happen to Wheel of Power, which was kind of their Games of Thronian, Swordian, Dragony.
Wheel of Time. Yeah.
Wheel of Time. I mean, I know you said it's much cheaper. That's absolutely true, but is there a reason for that? Or are they going to say, hey, like, your collateral damage, we don't need you anymore?
I don't think they would because, again, I mean, it's much cheaper, but $80 million is still nothing to sneeze at, right? $80 million for 8 episodes is still a significant amount of money. $10 million an episode, not the most expensive show, but I would say it's still probably top 10 or top 20 on the most expensive show list.
And they don't get cheaper year 2.
Yeah, exactly. Well, in some regards, they don't. At least the beauty is that you don't have to spend any more money on building a world. You now are spending money on narrative structure. And that's why, this is why I was saying it's the same thing for Lord of the Rings. When they said that they were going to commit to $1 billion over 5 seasons, well, they've already spent half of that in the first season. I think that it's probably, I'm not saying the next season is going to cost them another $480 million, but it's not going to be $200 million. It'll get cheaper, but it won't get that much cheaper. You're still going to be paying over the odds. For Wheel of Time, it's a really good question, actually, what you've asked is Wheel of Time, I don't see them abandoning it. I do, however, see them start counting pennies when it comes to other movies that they would otherwise create. Especially if the show isn't going to get more subscribers on their platform.
I mean, I would say for everyone who's at Amazon who's looking for a contract negotiation, they've probably lost a little bit of their leverage.
Yes.
Like if Wheel of Time starts to say, hey, I mean, you need us, Amazon will be like, we absolutely don't need you. Yeah. Here's our offer. We'll do it again at $80 million for 10 episodes. Take it, don't take it. Like, we don't care either way.
Yeah,
like I feel like
we've got our platform seller.
Yeah, I feel like they've kind of lost their leverage. By the same token, I mean, I feel like the buyer's market for a lot of other stuff is now probably getting a little bit thinner. Where if there's someone who's like, hey, we've got this epic blah, 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 Amazon, are you interested? Otherwise, we'll shop it to Netflix. Amazon will be like, nah, we're not interested. Suddenly, that show or IP or whatever has kind of lost their leverage. There's probably one less buyer out there. So I would think Amazon would probably be in the market for more stuff that's not these epic fantasy dramas. And they're probably going to focus on more action, more sci-fi, like The Expanse and stuff like that would be.
It's super interesting you say that because Amazon, prior to the release of Rings of Power, also signed a deal with the Russo brothers to make a new spy action series called Citadel. It hasn't been released yet, and it is their second most expensive TV show at $250 million for 8 episodes.
I mean, how much does it cost how much is an Amazon subscription? Can you remind me?
They just increased the price in the UK. I think it's like 80 or 90 pounds for the year if you pay on an annual basis, or it's like 9 pounds or 10 pounds a month. Something like that.
Let's just do 9. How many subscribers do they have? We did this
so officially
last
it's like 200 something million. But I think it's going to be... like for subscribers to Amazon or to Amazon Prime Video?
Amazon Video.
Oh, I no idea.
50 million?
So for Prime Video, Amazon claims that they have 200 million users. Yeah. But people believe that number is actually higher because there's a lot of people who have Amazon Prime accounts that don't use Prime Video.
I mean, I don't know if they have 200 million.
And I can believe that. How many people... in my family alone, there are 3 Amazon Prime accounts, and only one of them uses it for Amazon Prime Video.
Yeah, I mean, I guess that's huge money. It's huge money, I guess. But anyway, I don't know. I'd like to see their financials, how much they're actually making from Prime Video, and how much all their content is costing. I mean, they certainly have the money to afford another $1 billion. but I'm really curious as to how much additional subscribers it generates or how much, I guess, unsubscribes it prevents, right?
I think what's important is that it's getting to the point where the market is kind of saturated for these really expensive TV programs. It's getting harder and harder to justify. I'll give you the simplest example was when Top Gear ended with Jeremy Clarkson, the three guys, Richard Hammond, James May, Jeremy Clarkson. Yeah. When they left the BBC to create their own show, The Grand Tour, Netflix said no to them because they went to Netflix and said that we want, I'm making the number up, whatever the number is, $100 million or $200 million to make the show. Netflix outright said, no, we're not interested. That's too expensive. And Amazon said yes because Amazon was starved for content. That's not going to happen anymore. Yeah. I think those days are gone where people will go to Amazon and say, fine, we'll come to you, but I want $200 million. Because Amazon's just going to, like you rightly said, we've got our platform seller. We're not going to pay over the odds for any show now.
So let me just put this in perspective with math, right? This is just back of the envelope speculation stuff.
Okay.
Let's do this in dollars just for like convenience, right? I'm not going to do this in pounds and stuff. $1 billion. If you say an annual subscription is $90,
okay,
right? That's basically 11.1 million people. Now that's not $1 billion a year, right? I mean, it's a little bit less. You take 250 million, you divide by 5, right? 5 seasons, so it's kind of 50 million a year. It's another, call it 500, right? So I mean, I guess from Amazon's perspective, if they're just doing the math, it's probably not absurd for them to think that this is going to generate at least 11 million new subscriptions or 11 million people that do not unsubscribe, right?
Right. I think that's the second part is more viable. I think it's easier for us to think of them as saying we're stemming the blood loss of 11 million subscribers a year.
Yeah. So I mean, let's take it at $500 million. I mean, that's $500 million, huge. What I'm doing is I'm taking $450 for the production cost.
Yeah.
Okay, there's
plus
no marketing,
amortizing
there's
the
no
50
overhead.
million over the the 250 over 5
years.
Yes.
Yep. So $500 million divided by $90, which is an annual subscription, that's 5.5 million subscribers.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, if you divide that in half, you say, look, 2.5 million will not unsubscribe and 2.5 million will be new subscribers. For a show this big, that seems pretty realistic, right?
That's realistic. And I mean, again, relatively speaking, reasonable.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, of course, we're still talking about $500 million, so nothing is reasonable about that.
Yeah.
But in the grand scheme of things, relatively reasonable.
Yeah.
That means your customer acquisition cost for 2.5 million subscribers and retention of 2.5 million subscribers is $500 million.
Yeah.
It's an absurd number, but at the same time, not that absurd either.
So, I mean, I guess if you're just looking at that, it seems reasonable. I mean, that number, like you said, it doesn't count sales and marketing. There's so many other costs that go into this. It's probably like another 50% when you just talk about like overhead and some cost and other stuff. But still, if you're just looking at as big as Amazon is, if that's kind of what they need to justify this, it seems doable.
Yeah. Yeah. And by the way, this is us also just looking at season 1. And this is also us assuming that it stays at the same quality. I mean, don't forget, Game of Thrones, in terms of viewership, had an upward trajectory. It went up 5 times, right?
Yeah, it went to 46 million by the last season. Right. Over
so
8
from
years,
9 million to 45.
Yeah.
So it goes up 5 times. Who's to say that doesn't happen for Lord of the Rings as well?
Yeah. So, I mean, I guess I can see this being justified. Yeah, based on that, I think we probably would both assume that it is going to be around for 5 years.
Yeah, I would expect it to be. You don't spend $1 billion on 8 episodes and then call it a day.
Yeah.
If it's a failure, that's when Amazon sits down and says, okay, let's sack the writing team. Let's get a new writing team. Let's go for season 2 and really push it. for a successful season 2. You don't call it an end of the day because, yes, there's the sunk cost fallacy, but, the upside far outweighs the downside if you get this right.
To be seen, but we've got a very good head-to-head battle of House of the Dragon and Rings of Power.
Yeah, and I think what we should do is probably maybe not necessarily do a weekly recap, but if there's any significant moments, I think we'll certainly touch upon them. But I think probably at the midway point for each season, for either season, we can probably do a quick recap to see where things are and see if our ratings have changed.
Yeah. I think we could also do something that's a little bit fun. If we look at these two as kind of like running a race against each other, yeah, we can maybe do something where who we think is like in the lead.
Yeah.
Yeah. Like,
or like almost like a fantasy football league kind of thing.
Yeah. Right? Yeah. Because right now I still think House of the Dragon is in the lead. I think we've done a way better job on the character development and establishing like kind of what the major issues are going forward, right?
Yeah.
Whereas I feel like Rings of Power has established visually what is kind of the landscape, but they haven't really opened us up to who is who and what's really going on yet.
Yeah, you're right. For your average viewer, there's still a lot of question marks in Rings of Power, even after episode 2. Whereas in House of the Dragon, even if you're a newcomer, there are very few question marks. Even if you don't know anything about the Game of Thrones world, you know what the central conflict for season 1 of House of the Dragon is by the end of episode 2. That's not the case for Rings of Power.
Okay. That is episode 100 for
Congratulations once again,
Films
Ethan.
and Stuff. Congratulations, Pete. It was a pleasure doing these first 100 episodes with you. Thank you, listeners, for keeping us on your playlist. Don't forget to continue to download, give us comments, and pester Pete as much as you can for your hoodie.
Aloha at filmsandstuffpodcast.com or tweet at us at F&S Podcast.
And don't forget to check out our YouTube channel. We've done some really wonderful things there visually. Let us know if you like it, don't like it, or are indifferent to it.
And just to recap, Lord of the Rings, The Rings of Power, I am giving it a mooch at this stage as a preview for the season.
Well, you put me in a tough spot, Pete. I mean, I guess my personal opinion is yes. It is also a mooch. However, this is going to be around for a while, and I think it's going to be extremely popular, and I think a lot of people are going to watch it. So to the extent that you want to not have spoilers, to the extent that you want to be up to speed, I urge you to consider making it a subscribe. But for me personally, after watching 2 episodes, it's a mooch.
Yeah. And of course, we caveat the score by saying that it is probably going to change. I hope it becomes a must subscribe. But as Ethan rightly pointed out, this show isn't going anywhere. In our humble opinion, you are going to hear about this show by hook or by crook in your personal life, whether you want to or not. So if you want to be a part of that conversation, you're probably going to want to watch this show.
Basically, decide if you want to be a participating member of society. If yes, subscribe. If not, mooch.
Exactly. So we are mooching at this stage, but it is likely,
Well, we're subscribing, but we're recommending a mooch. We're recommending a mooch.
Yeah. At this stage, purely on the basis of the show, not without any extenuating circumstances, Your Honor.
That's right. Everyone, thank you for joining us. Episode 100 is in the bag. We'll see you next week. Films and Stuff.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Pete. Bye now.
Bye, guys.
Thank you for listening to another episode of Films and Stuff. If you haven't already, please subscribe and review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever podcasts are downloaded. Films and Stuff. There is no substitute.